You mean I should leave your house? I asked, tears welling in my eyes as I clutched the doorknob of the very home I built with my husband. Take your bag and leave. This isn't your home anymore, my son's wife snapped, her face filled with arrogance. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently against the doorframe as if my very presence disgusted her. And my son, my only son, stood silently beside her. He didn't defend me. He didn't speak a word. He simply watched as his wife kicked me out of the very house where I had raised him, the same boy I had rocked to sleep in these very rooms, the same child I had nursed through countless fevers and nightmares. The rain was beginning to fall as I stepped onto the porch, my suitcase heavy in my trembling hands. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Mrs. Henderson from next door even stepped out, her face filled with concern. "Linda, what's happening? Where are you going with that suitcase?" she called out. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law slammed the door behind me. The sound echoed through the neighborhood like a gunshot. The next morning, she moved her parents into my home, as if I had never even existed. I watched from across the street as they carried in their furniture, laughing and chatting as if they were moving into a house they had bought themselves. 60 years of sacrifice, erased in one night. But what they didn't know was that I was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Now let me ask you, what would you do if your own family humiliated you this way? Would you walk away quietly, or would you fight back? Tell me in the comments while you listen, because what happened next left everyone speechless. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of my upcoming revenge stories. Let me take you back, before the funeral, before the betrayal. I had been married to my husband for over 40 years. Together, we built a modest but beautiful life. We didn't have much, but we had each other. Harold worked at the steel mill for 30 years, his hands growing rough and calloused from honest work. I cleaned houses and took in sewing to make ends meet. We worked hard, 2 jobs at times, to make sure our only son had everything he needed. I remember the Christmas when Harold worked double shifts for 3 months straight just to buy our son that bicycle he wanted. The red one with the silver bell that he'd stared at in the shop window every day after school. I remember nights when I went to bed hungry just so he could eat. Days when I sold my jewelry to pay for his school books. My grandmother's pearl necklace, my mother's wedding ring. Piece by piece, I sold our family treasures to invest in his future. We poured everything into him, believing that one day he would take care of us the way we took care of him. When he graduated college, the first in our family, Harold and I wept with joy. All those sacrifices had been worth it. This house, the one his wife kicked me out of, wasn't just bricks and walls. It was where I first held him in my arms, counting his tiny fingers and toes, where we celebrated his first steps, his first words, birthdays, Christmases, and quiet family dinners around our old oak table. Every corner of that home carried memories. The kitchen where I taught him to make his grandmother's apple pie. The living room where we watched his favorite cartoons together. The backyard where Harold built him a treehouse that still stood, weathered but proud. But after my husband's funeral, all of that love and sacrifice seemed to vanish, like smoke in the wind. It began softly, almost disguised as concern. At the funeral reception, my son's wife whispered to me, "This house is too big for you now. Don't worry. We'll take care of it." She placed her hand on my shoulder, but her touch felt cold, calculating. I thought she meant she wanted to help. Perhaps they'd move in to keep me company, to make sure I wasn't lonely. But her smile, that smile told another story. It didn't reach her eyes. Instead, those eyes were already surveying my home like a predator sizing up its prey. That same week, I overheard her on the phone in Harold's study. Yes, Mother, it's perfect. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and that beautiful garden you've always wanted. Don't worry about Linda. We'll handle that situation. My blood ran cold. Situation? Is that what I had become? A week later, she confronted me directly. We were sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had fed my son thousands of meals, where Harold and I had shared our morning coffee for decades. You can't live here alone, she said, stirring her tea with aggressive clinks against the porcelain. My parents will move in. You can go stay somewhere else. Maybe a nursing home would be better. There's a lovely one across town, Sunset Manor. Very affordable. The way she said affordable made my skin crawl, as if I were some charity case to be disposed of efficiently. My heart broke. But the deeper cut? My son stood right there in the doorway and said nothing. He was reading the newspaper, pretending not to hear, but I saw his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. When I begged him, "This is my home. Your father's home. Where you grew up." He looked down at his shoes, the same shoes I had bought him for his first job interview, and said quietly, "It's for the best, Mom." Those 5 words shattered something inside me that I didn't know could break. "For the best?" I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. For whose best? Certainly not mine. He couldn't meet my eyes. My own son, the boy I had carried for 9 months, couldn't look at his mother. Humiliation doesn't even begin to describe it. They made me pack my bags in front of neighbors. Mrs. Henderson came over with tears in her eyes, offering to help. Old Mr. Peterson shook his head in disgust, muttering about, "What's wrong with kids these days?" People whispered. Some shook their heads in pity. Others whispered, "How could her own son do this, after everything Linda did for that boy?" I could hear their voices carrying on the evening breeze as I loaded my life into 3 suitcases and a cardboard box. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted most? Someone you would have died for? Let me know in the comments, because I know I'm not the only one who's felt this knife twist in their heart. But that wasn't the end. Oh no. That was just the beginning of my humiliation. The very next morning, I drove by the house. I couldn't help myself. It was like watching a car accident. I knew it would hurt, but I couldn't look away. Her parents moved into my bedroom, where Harold and I had shared 40 years of whispered dreams and quiet conversations, where we had planned our retirement, where we had held each other through his final illness. I watched through tears as they threw out Harold's belongings to make space. My late husband's clothes, his books, his reading glasses, even his old armchair, the brown leather recliner where he'd spent countless evenings reading the newspaper or watching the evening news. I'll never forget walking past the trash bin later that day and seeing Harold's winter coat, the one he wore every winter for 20 years, crumpled like garbage. The same coat I had saved for months to buy him, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne and pipe tobacco. I pulled it from the trash when no one was looking, clutching it to my chest as I sobbed in my car. Weeks turned into months. They painted over the growth chart Harold had marked on the kitchen doorframe. Every inch of our son's childhood erased with 2 coats of beige paint. They ripped out my rose garden, the one Harold had planted for our 10th anniversary, and replaced it with ugly concrete pavers. They hosted family dinners in my home. I wasn't invited, of course. I would walk by. Yes, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I couldn't stay away and hear laughter inside. Through the windows I had cleaned thousands of times. I could see my son carving turkey at the head of my dining table. My grandchildren, once my joy, my reason for living, began ignoring me. When I tried to approach them at the grocery store, they looked away. Little Emma, who used to run to me with open arms, hid behind her mother's skirt. One day, my grandson Tommy looked me in the eye and said, "Mommy says you're boring and poor. She says we don't have to talk to you anymore." Those words cut deeper than any knife could. I had to grip the shopping cart to keep from falling. This was the same boy I had babysat every weekend, the child I had taught to ride a bicycle, whose scraped knees I had bandaged with cartoon band-aids. At church, my daughter-in-law bragged to anyone who would listen. "We own 2 houses now," she'd announce proudly to the ladies' auxiliary. "We're thinking of renting the smaller one out for extra income." The smaller one. That was how she referred to the modest apartment where I now lived, surviving on Harold's small pension and Social Security. Meanwhile, neighbors whispered, "Poor Linda, pushed out by her own child. Can you imagine? After everything she sacrificed for that ungrateful boy." Everywhere I turned, the shame followed me. At the bank, at the post office, at the diner where Harold and I used to share coffee every Sunday morning. People looked at me with pity, and somehow that felt worse than anger would have. What would you do if your daughter-in-law replaced you in your own home like yesterday's garbage? Would you forgive this kind of calculated cruelty? Or would you fight back with everything you had? Comment? Yes, if you believe no parent deserves this kind of heartless disrespect, no matter what. I hit my lowest point on what would have been my 42nd wedding anniversary, October 15th. Harold and I had always celebrated quietly, dinner at Romano's Italian restaurant, then a walk through Central Park to see the autumn leaves. Instead of celebrating with my husband, I sat alone on a park bench, watching couples walk by hand in hand. The autumn wind scattered leaves around my feet like confetti for a celebration that would never come. An elderly man sat down beside me, noticing my tears. "You okay, dear?" he asked kindly. "Today would have been my wedding anniversary," I managed to whisper. "Where's your husband?" he asked gently. "Dead," I replied. "And my son, he might as well be dead too." That night I cried more than I had in years. I cried for Harold, for my son, for the grandchildren who no longer knew my name. I cried for the house that held 40 years of memories, now occupied by strangers who cared nothing for its history. But as the tears dried, something inside me shifted. Something hard and determined that I hadn't felt since I was a young woman fighting for my family's survival. "No more," I whispered to Harold's photograph on my nightstand. "No more tears. No more humiliation. It's time they learn who I really am." You see, they thought age had made me weak. They saw a grieving widow and assumed I was helpless, defeated. But age hadn't made me weak. Age had made me wise. Age had taught me patience, strategy, and the value of keeping certain cards close to my chest. What they didn't know, what my son had forgotten in his greed and his wife had never bothered to discover, was that years ago, my husband and I had been much more careful with our finances than anyone realized. Harold wasn't just a simple steel worker. He was a union man, a smart investor who had quietly built our nest egg over decades of careful planning. And when we bought the house, when we bought the second property across town that we used as a rental, we had placed both properties in a trust under my name. Legally, everything was mine. Every paper, every document carried my signature as the primary beneficiary and trustee. Harold had insisted on it, saying, "Linda, you're stronger than you know. If anything happens to me, I want you to be protected." The house they thought they owned? Mine. The rental property that provided a steady income? Also mine. The bank accounts, the investments, the life insurance policies, all of it was legally, undeniably mine. My son had assumed that everything would automatically pass to him as the only child. His wife had calculated their takeover based on ignorance and arrogance. Neither of them had bothered to consult a lawyer or examine any legal documents. And not just that, I also had control over another property. A beautiful 3-bedroom house in the nice part of town that we had bought as an investment 15 years ago. My son had no idea it existed because Harold and I had been discreet about our financial dealings. Quietly, carefully, I contacted my lawyer, the same man who had handled Harold's will and our trust documents. Robert Martinez had been our family attorney for 20 years, And when I told him what had happened, his voice turned ice cold. "Linda," he said, "they can't do this. Legally, they have no standing. None whatsoever. We prepared everything. Eviction notices, legal documentation, a complete audit of the trust assets. Robert worked with surgical precision, making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. Meanwhile, I played along. I let them think I was broken. I let them see me shuffling through the grocery store with my small cart and my clipped coupons. I let them watch me counting change at the pharmacy. I let them laugh. I let them boast. Because I knew the day was coming. And when it came, I wanted their shock to be complete, their humiliation absolute. That day came during a family dinner they hosted in my house, 3 months after they had thrown me out like trash. It was Thanksgiving. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her parents sat in my dining chairs, sipping expensive wine like royalty. They had invited their friends, my former neighbors, showing off their beautiful home. My son laughed at jokes that made me the punchline, telling stories about his crazy old mother who couldn't accept change. My daughter-in-law smirked, proud of how far she'd pushed me, proud of how completely she had erased me from my own life. She was wearing my grandmother's china like it was her own, serving turkey from the platter Harold and I had used for 20 years. I had been watching from across the street for an hour, waiting for the perfect moment. When I saw them all gathered around the table, my table, I knew it was time. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell, the doorbell that played Home Sweet Home. Harold had installed it as a surprise for our anniversary 15 years ago. My daughter-in-law opened the door, her face immediately twisting with annoyance. "What are you doing here, Linda? You can't just show up uninvited." "Actually," I said, stepping into the foyer with my lawyer beside me, "I can, because this is my house." And then I stood. Calm. Steady. Strong. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. "You think this house belongs to you?" I said, my voice carrying across the table, reaching every shocked face, every dropped fork. "You think you can steal a woman's home, her memories, her very identity? No. This house belongs to me, and it always has." Gasps filled the room. The expensive wine glasses stopped mid-sip. I handed the documents to my lawyer, who read them aloud in his clear, professional voice. The trust documents, the property deeds, the bank statements. Every eye widened as the truth settled in like a heavy fog. "Starting tonight," I said, looking directly at my son, "you and your wife and her parents will pack your bags and leave, because this house isn't yours to claim. It never was, and it never will be." Her smirk vanished like ice in summer. My son's face turned pale as fresh snow. Her parents stood frozen in shame, their wine glasses trembling in their hands. The neighbors who had been invited to witness my humiliation instead became witnesses to my vindication. But, my daughter-in-law stammered, "You can't. You don't have anywhere else to go." I smiled for the first time in months. "Actually, I do. I have a lovely 3-bedroom house across town, the one you didn't know about, the one where I'll be very comfortable." That night, it wasn't me who was humiliated. It was them. They left in silence, dragging their suitcases down the path I once walked in tears. Neighbors watched from their porches, some clapping softly, others nodding in approval. Mrs. Henderson called out, "Welcome home, Linda." I spent that evening alone in my house, our house, Harold's and mine. I sat in his old leather chair, the one I had rescued from the trash, and felt his presence around me like a warm embrace. I reclaimed my home, my dignity, and my peace. The next morning, I called my son. He answered on the first ring, his voice small and ashamed. "Mom, You what?" I asked quietly. "You're sorry? You didn't know? You were just following your wife's lead?" Silence. You made your choice, I continued. You chose her over the woman who gave you life, who sacrificed everything for your happiness. You stood by and watched while she destroyed me. I know, he whispered. I know, and I hate myself for it. Good, I said. That's a start. I didn't forgive him that day. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't something you hand out like candy. It has to be earned, and earning it would take time. Time he might not have. But I did leave the door open. Just a crack. Because despite everything, he was still my son. As I sat in my husband's old chair that evening, watching the sunset through the windows I had cleaned 10,000 times, I whispered to his photograph, "They thought they buried me, Harold. They thought they could erase me like chalk from a blackboard. But they forgot. I was a seed, and seeds always rise." 6 months later, my son called again. His marriage was falling apart. His wife's parents had sued him for their legal fees from the eviction. His children barely spoke to him. "I lost everything," he said, crying. "Everything that mattered." "No," I replied gently. "You still have a mother who loves you. You just forgot where to find her." "He's been coming to Sunday dinners for the past month. It's a start. My grandchildren are slowly learning to trust me again. Little Emma brought me a drawing last week, a picture of a house with the words Grandma's Home written in crayon. And me? I wake up every morning in the house where I belong, surrounded by memories of the man who loved me and the life we built together. Justice isn't always swift, and it isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient, quiet, and absolutely devastating. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you, please like, share, comment, and subscribe so you never miss another tale. And don't forget to come back tomorrow. I'll be sharing how I repaid my son after he abandoned me in an orphanage home. A story you won't want to miss. See you.